Hi, it's Phoenix again, and I'm going to read a chapter from my book Silent Noise called Musings. And I would just say, as I'm reading this chapter, let your mind get carried away and, as they say, muse. And, um, and I hope that this chapter is amusing, pardon the pun. And yeah, so we'll see how it goes. Thank you. Musings. It isn't long before I run into the muse of poetry or the muse of poetic song. This really isn't all that surprising when considering how dedicated I've been with sharing my poetry. I figured it was bound to eventually get the attention of one of the figures that inspired poetry in others. I run into her when I'm by myself, sitting in a coffee shop and just musing. It has already been a good day so far. I've shared my poetry with 5 people, and it isn't even past 2 o'clock yet. I shared with a kid my age, whose parents were very thrilled and inspired by a poet as young as me, trying to find their way in the world, when considering how harsh things could be. It certainly inspired the kid, who had been picked on before for being deaf. So I did one of my most inspiring poems, and it completely changed his perspective. I stand up, looking down, and that's when I run into the muse of poetry. I look up and am surprised at what I see. I see one of the most beautiful women in all existence. She's wearing a white dress, and even though she isn't wearing any makeup, her face is radiant, and her eyes are sapphires, jewels of the highest order. I quickly sign, "I apologize," and she signs back, "Don't worry about it. I wasn't paying attention, but I was looking for you." "You were looking for me?" I sign back. She nods her head. "Yeah, care to join me?" She sits down, and I sit down as well. I figure, what do I have to lose? It'd be foolish to pass up a chance to talk to the muse of poetry. I know she's part of the reason why I'm always inspired to share and why I always come up with new ideas. There was no way I was going to pass up this offer. I state the obvious. "So you must be the muse of poetry." She nods, then signs. It's kind of a taxing business at times. It's honestly amazing how inspiring poets has changed throughout the years, ranging from Plato's early attack on the innocent bards of the time to modern strictures that poetry isn't viable, doesn't sell, and is thus meaningless, obsolete, putting a lot of active and active-minded poets out of the business. It gets frustrating, but I'm not here to talk about the politics of poetry strictly. I also want to talk about you. I'm not quite sure if this is a compliment, but I assume it is, and so I say thanks. She nods distantly and then says, distantly, as if she's trying to capture an idea that has long eluded her, that she can barely see in the distance, but that refuses to come closer, moving further from her as she steps toward it like a mirage. She says, "What inspires you, Micah?" I'm a little taken aback by this comment. What inspires me? You mean, what inspires my poetry? She nods. I think about this. I know we're certainly here to muse, that much is clear. Muse about poetry and life and the philosophy of poetry. But this feels like heavy-duty thought, rather than just simple bantering. What do you mean? I sign carefully, because I'm honestly very confused. You don't get any of your inspiration from me, the muse of poetry said, and there was a trace of hurt in this, but also a trace of wonder. Most of the greats have been inspired by me, if not through their entire lives, then at least at one point or other in their lives. Even Shakespeare had moments where he needed my divine presence. He wouldn't have been able to come up with his sonnet subversion if it hadn't been for me. By sonnet subversion, you mean the fact that he writes about some of the negative aspects of love rather than romanticizing it, the trend of the sonnet at the time, correct? The muse nods, not necessarily dismissively, but as if there's much, much more to talk about. She continues. Michelangelo wouldn't have even bothered to write poetry if it hadn't been for me. Gerard Demerval wouldn't have been as mystical and magical if I hadn't helped him fine-tune his experiences. And goodness, the list goes on. I guided Robert Lax, that great homeless poet, for a while as well, by encouraging him to go to certain places to write his poetry and to try new things. D.H. Lawrence was chiefly a novelist at heart, but I inspired him to write poetry, and Borges, even though he considered himself first and foremost a poet, wouldn't have even scratched the surface of his real poetic talent if it hadn't been for me. I also fine-tuned some of Li Po's experiences to help him become more rigorous in his style as he continued along writing, and honestly, the list goes on and on. It goes on forever. Some poets, like Lorca, I inspired forever, until his unfair death, of course. Even though Boethius tried to make me look like a fool, accused me of being devoid of reason, reason rather than full of passion. I don't care. I know that I'm an important figure throughout history and throughout art. I've helped poets accomplish so much, more than they'd ever think they could or would have accomplished if it hadn't been for me. But you, Micah, I mean, you generate poetry without even the slightest bit of help from me. How did you come up with the brave move of leaving your home to go and share poetry? That's simply unheard of. I mean, we have bards, some even classical, who have done what you've done, but it's rare, because most people think poetry has to be written in a text or shared at a library to be valid, with the exception of court poets and the troubadours, of course. And speaking of medieval art, part of the reason why the author of Beowulf is anonymous is because I told the poet that they would be immortalized more in the canon of true poetry if they didn't have a name to hold them accountable, making Beowulf a kind of literary mystery, but also a valued literary treasure. I think about everything that the muse is telling me. She's telling me I generate my own creativity and inspiration, which is interesting because in a way it separates me from other poets who needed a higher force of intervention. It puts me apart, and I'm not sure I'm a fan of that, not because it makes me better than any of these poets. I'm obviously no better than Charles Bukowski, who the muse continues to tell me inspired to write poetry so long because she helped inspire him to focus more on poetry than getting drunk all the time. But because it seems to suggest that I've turned my back on the muse, that doesn't seem very nice. I'm just going to muse and haphazard a guess as to why I haven't used your services, I say. Do tell, signs the muse. I think it just hasn't been time for me to acquire your services yet. I think it's too soon. I think there are a lot of things that I, as a budding poet, have to figure out first before I just, well, you know, before I get help from the master of poetry. This seems to help the muse a little bit. She even smiles. I can tell, however, that she isn't completely convinced yet. That's not a bad hypothesis, the muse says, but do you see my fear? I'm worried that future ambitious poets are going to put me out of the job. I'm worried that I'm going to become obsolete. I know a poet in Dallas, Texas, that will never need my services, even though he's going to become such a great poet one day. I mean, it's not like I haven't had a hard life, slammed to the ground by Plato and Boethius and other poets, only to be thankfully revived in a very Renaissance way by the likes of Sidney, who himself was also pretty stubborn in taking my advice on poetry, because he had to go get himself killed so early. And it isn't like the harsh working conditions for poets haven't gotten to me at one time or another. All that wasted talent just because poetry doesn't sell. And who are you, sharing your poetry even though not everybody can understand you, and doing something so beautifully romantic? It's incredible, I've got to say, but I wish you'd enlist my help. I think about all that the muse is telling me. At first, I'm not sure what to say. Even though she isn't trying to guilt me, I feel that way nonetheless. So I say, how do you want to inspire me? How do I want to inspire you? This question seems to catch the muse off guard, as if she's expecting me to kick her to the curb any moment now. She doesn't sign anything for a moment, but then, I don't know. That's a good question. Maybe simply reverse the roles and you inspire me, muse, with your poetry. Then the muse smiles, and I smile back, liking this plan. So you want a poem dedicated to you, I sign. She blushes a little. Well, you wouldn't have to go that far, but just inspire me with your awesome poetry. Okay, sounds good, I say, and then I begin. What would we do without the muse of poetry? What would we do without the true bard of forms? We'd probably end up blind to the subtle beauties of the illuminated manuscript that we all hold in our hands, a manuscript that has some of the best poems ever written. Chaucer wouldn't have been as successful, we all know that. Where would Dante have come up with his ideas for his Divine Comedy? How would he have known how to structure the work? Ah, the muse of poetry, so innocent and playful in her inspiration and aspiration, so important to us all. Musing to try and figure it all out, to help us become better makers, better craftsmen and craftswomen, to help us understand poesy. Oh, divine muse of all poetic language, what would we do without your guidance? We'd be nowhere, we'd only muse like Plato without any solid passion, without any true art. We'd be confused because there'd be no art, and modern-day poets would have a harder and harder time not making a living. Muse, this poem is for you. Flattery can be insulting if done wrong, of course, and it can be ever so sycophantic, but I only mean to be romantic, in the poetic sense, though I might send you a rose for luck. I only mean to refuse being pedantic, and hope that we all feel true inspiration, that we all write the purest poems ever possible, that we understand true poetry. I look over at the muse and see that she's taken out a tissue and is sniffing slightly. She dabs her eyes a little melodramatically and then says, "That was beautiful. You didn't have to write that for me. Well, you helped inspire it, quite literally, I signed. Without you being here, I wouldn't have written a no to the Muse of Poetic Song, and that would have been sad. To never write homage to the Muse of Poetry, you can't call yourself a true poet unless you've acknowledged where your inspiration comes from. The Muse looks at me happily, her eyes still tearing up, and then smiles at me warmly. Thank you so much, Micah. You're a truly gifted individual. You're going to make waves in the poetic world one day, if you haven't already. The Muse then reaches into a purse that comes out of nowhere and pulls out a planner. I need to reprioritize, the Muse says triumphantly. I was going to go help the poet laureate of Sweden, but I think they've become so pig-headed and shallow poetically, as well as with some vanity and self-importance thrown in, that we'll see where they go without my help. But there is, however, a young street poet who likes to dibble and dabble in street art that I'd like to go help. I think they could much better use my services. Then I have a meeting with the poet laureate of France, and then, oh goodness, the list goes on, and all the things I need to change. I need to give a symposium on Rita Dove's poetry and address the problems and simultaneous benefits of the avant-garde. And well, there's a lot I need to do, as you can see, but I can do it. All thanks to you, Micah. I suppose poetry can thrive on its own terms. It doesn't always have to be poetic music with a big, theatrical, obnoxious studio sound. It can just be. That's all I expect out of poetry. Then the Muse shakes my hand like she's just met a superstar and then disappears. I stay there for a moment, musing. Then I smile and walk out of the building. I can't stop my smile from spreading.